Select Committee for the end of the transitional period, and we are very fortunate to have both the Secretary of State and the Permanent Secretary with us this afternoon. So, Secretary of State, if you'd like to just introduce yourself for the record, and then Tamara, please.
I'm George Eustice, Secretary of State at DEFRA.
Thank you.
I'm Tamara Finkelstein, the Permanent Secretary for DEFRA.
Okay, thank you very much both for joining us. So, I'm going to ask the first question on trade, basically. So, last week the Prime Minister committed to reciprocal tariff on EU imports if there is a no EU deal. How will you protect domestic food producers while also ensuring that tariffs don't lead to increased food prices for consumers? So, I imagine that one is firmly in your court, Secretary of State. George?
Yes, well, we've published the UK global tariff earlier this year, which is a revision from the original proposal of a temporary tariff last year. That envisages slightly lower tariffs, I think, than the EU currently have, but still significant tariffs on those sensitive sectors, in particular on beef and sheep. Some liberalisation in other areas, but broadly speaking, the UK global tariff keeps in place tariffs that would be applied reciprocally if we're left without an agreement.
I mean, I think I'm right in saying that if we actually leave under a WTO-type situation, then the tariffs that we charge the EU will have to be the same as we charge to the rest of the world. So, I mean, will you have to alter the tariffs that you've already published?
No, so what happens is, and it gets quite complicated, so we do have, we are in the process at the moment, as you'll recall, this has been gone through, splitting the EU's WTO tariff schedule and allocating certain TRQs in the agricultural context that then become part of an inherited TRQ for the UK. So we are taking a proportion of the the New Zealand lamb TRQ, and we're taking a significant proportion of the chicken from Thailand TRQ as well, and that will be rolled over in the WTO schedule. But in addition to that, what we then can publish is our own UK global tariff, which is effectively the tariffs that we then apply fairly and equally to all countries. So yes, the UK global tariff would apply the same to the United States and Brazil, just as it does to Ireland and France and other EU members.
Now, yourselves and DEFRA, I think, have been looking at the effects on food prices if we have to impose tariffs. Better that we have a deal and we don't impose tariffs, but if we do, what is the likely effect on food prices?
Well, the impact from tariffs per se is probably quite modest. I mean, this work has been done by a number of people, including, I think, the Resolution Foundation looked at this issue a couple of years ago. And the impact of tariffs themselves on consumer food prices is, a few percentage points. And sometimes people find that surprising because obviously they're conscious of the headline tariffs on a lot of agricultural commodities. But the reason for that is that the agricultural commodity component of the weekly shopping basket is actually a small part of the overall cost. A lot of the other costs relate to distribution, to manufacturing, to added value that goes into highly processed foods. And that's why that headline tariff rate, that might be, say, 40%, doesn't typically translate into the same price increase for consumers. However, that's not the whole picture, because the factor that probably has the greatest impact on food prices is exchange rate movements, and obviously we don't know what would happen to the exchange rate in the new year. But if there were a depreciation in sterling, then that could start to lever up the price impacts. But the impacts of tariffs per se on consumer prices is actually quite modest.
If we take bread, for instance, and bread making wheat, what's the likelihood tariff on wheat, and especially bread making wheat? Because we import quite a bit of that, don't we?
We import some, and I'm afraid I don't have the figures directly to hand, but my Permanent Secretary, I know it's something that we asked for, so she may be able to put her hands on that specific figure. But the other thing that I would say is when it comes to bread is a good case in point. The UK has the most efficient and competitive bread manufacturing industry in the whole world, and that's because we've got three major players in Warburton's, ABF and Hovis, who are technically the best in the world, and they compete vigorously with one another, and as a result we've got some of the cheapest bread in the world. And the impact of a price rise in wheat is actually fairly small, because the price of wheat represents about 9% of the overall price of a loaf of bread. And so an increase in fuel prices, because the real cost in bread is putting it on lorries and running it around the country, increase in fuel prices will always have a much greater impact on bread prices. But if you go to the other end of the spectrum, there are sectors like meats, and if you look at beef or bacon, if you were to put a big tariff on imported Irish beef and Danish bacon, well then you might see larger impacts than you would on something like bread or milk.
So, Secretary of State, this committee did a inquiry recently into COVID and 19 and the food supply chain, and we found that while the food supply chain worked pretty well, there were a lot of effects on people who couldn't afford food, getting that food out to the poorest in society. And of course, unfortunately, probably more people will need help with food. So, putting your sort of social hat on, are you worried that these food prices would cause, those poorest in society problems?
Well, look, obviously we need to keep all of these things, under review and watch it. The government's really aiming to keep food prices stable, and we don't have a policy. I don't think it's right for the government to have a policy for price fixing, whether up or down. Our approach should be to have a stable food supply and stable prices, and it's not the role of government to set prices. But, when it comes to people who have difficulties accessing food, obviously during the coronavirus episode from March onwards, we introduced food parcels for those that were shielding. We introduced a number of measures to support fair share, to support the work that they were doing to get food to economically vulnerable people. And we also worked with local authorities as well to come up with a grant scheme so that they could step in and help. So we did a series of interventions to try to help people who are financially vulnerable over the course of the summer.
Yeah, there was I think there's a £60 million scheme that DEFRA funded, and I know I've asked you this question before, but are you thinking of extending that, especially if there are problems with trade and food prices as we leave, or with the trade deal or without the trade deal with the EU?
Well, obviously we will, in the context of the coronavirus, we will monitor this, closely, just as we did before. At the moment, you will have noticed today from the announcement the Prime Minister's made, there's no plan to sort of put back a return to shielding. And also the measures that we had for the shielded during March and April onwards with those food parcels are less necessary now, because the supermarkets have actually developed a substantial increase in their delivery capacity. And they've agreed to give priority access to people who do shield should that return.
Yeah, I'm thinking more of the people who are finding it difficult to actually afford food, who are getting food through food banks and through charitable sector. And I think there is no doubt that there are people out there struggling. Trussell Trust and others will have the figures. So I think it's something that we need to be really aware of. So I'm sure you are, but is DEFRA looking at that as we speak? Or what?
Well, as I said, in the context of EU exit, the first thing is obviously we are still working very hard to try to get an agreement with the European Union, and that would have zero tariffs on all goods, and therefore that would be of assistance. If we don't get that, as I said, the analysis that's been done in this area suggests that the impact of tariffs per se on prices could be quite modest. But obviously, if there were a significant price rise, if that did then translate into serious food affordability problems, and of course the government would look at what action should be taken, just as we did earlier this summer.
Right, one sort of final question from me, and that is sort of, if we get to a situation where there are tariffs being imposed both in and out of the UK, then we have a situation where lambs in particular are likely to have a sort of £40 or so tariff on them. That will probably stop a lot of export if you're not at all careful. So one, are you going to compensate sheep farmers? And two, what are you going to do with the sheep meat if you've got all this extra sheep meat actually floating around in the UK market? Because, if we're not at all careful, the prices will drop.
Yes, we did a lot of work on this last year in the run-up to potential exit at the end of October. And the first thing to say is the modelling that we did at the time suggested that if the EU applied the full MFN tariff, I think it's around 40% on lambs for export, lamb prices in Europe would actually rise quite significantly because the EU dominates EU production and they don't really have anywhere else to go. So there would be an increase in prices of perhaps around 20%. For lamb, and that's because it is one of those more sensitive meats. In addition, that would dampen demand, and you would have an increase in supply on the UK market, and prices of lambs would probably fall by about 25%. Now, obviously, a lot of these things depend on the assumptions in the model, but broadly speaking, that's what we expected. The good news is that leaving at the end of December without an agreement is better than leaving either in March or in October, and that's because the peak export months tend to be in the autumn, around September, October, and in the new year, the months sort of January to April, lamb exports they happen, but at a much, much lower level. And so there's a window when probably farmers wouldn't feel a great deal of impact. To answer your specific question, though, if they did feel an impact, what would be our response? I think, given the timing of this particular departure, we would probably opt for some kind of ewe special premium for breeding ewes, because the farmers that would be hit first would be those that were raising the lambs.
Yeah, there will be some also hit sooner that have got store lambs which probably haven't been finished by January, but I suppose it's quite difficult to be able to deal with those particular farmers, is it?
There would be, but there's obviously still quite a strong domestic market, and that's a time of year when, if the price is right, New Zealand comes in quite substantial volumes, and if the price had been knocked southwards, you would expect New Zealand producers to be squeezed out of that market.
Right, and this last question is probably unfair, Secretary of State. So what are the chances of getting a deal with the EU then by the time we leave in January?
Look, it's no surprise that it's been a difficult set of negotiations. The EU have been quite intransigent on certain issues like state aid rules and on fisheries, where they effectively enjoy the same privileges that they have now with us as an EU member, and obviously we can't accept that. But it remains the fact that David Frost and his negotiating team are working very, very hard to try to get an agreement. I think people are still on both sides applying themselves with rigour and in good faith to try to get one. So I can't put a number on it, and I know David Frost himself has been very reluctant to try and put some kind of statistical probability figure on it, but we will be doing all that we can to try to get that agreement, and as the Prime Minister said, we need to make sure things come to a head by the middle of October.
Okay, I'll park it there. As you can imagine, we've got some supplementaries. So, first of all, Sheryll, then Barry, and then Geraint. So, Sheryll, please.
Yeah, this is Secretary of State. You probably haven't had discussions with the International Trade Secretary yet on this issue. And if you haven't, I wonder if you could just write to the committee once you have. We visited a company in my constituency on Friday, and I know I've written to you in the past about it, and they seem to have a problem with the identifying the common export tariff that is applicable for salmon, and they're finding it very difficult to write contracts because clearly if they put one specific price in, it could result in them having a contract where they undertake to make a loss on their exports. So the Secretary of State for International Trade, I understand, said there was a tariff finder, but she wasn't able to find the information that they wanted. When do you intend to publish the distinctive information that companies like this company need when they are writing contracts and they need to look to the future. I mean, clearly we don't know whether there's going to be a deal or whether we're going to have an Australian-style deal right now, but companies are looking now for certainty. And I wonder if you could just tell us where you can find this information and
yes.
if it's not available, when it will be available, please.
So there is a tariff finder, and our full UK global tariff is, line by line, is published, I think, on the DIT's website. But of course, it sounds from what you said that you're talking about the EU's common external tariff, and that is also a matter of public record. I don't think will change. There are, from memory, at least 2 different lines for salmon, depending on the level to which it's being processed. But it's pretty modest. It's around 2 or 3% as tariff. So as tariffs go, the tariff on farmed salmon is at the very much the lower end of tariffs on food. But in your specific case, if you wanted to contact my office with the specific product, we can give you, our veterinary team will be able to give you that tariff very quickly.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheryl. Barry now, Barry Gardiner, please, Barry.
Yes, Secretary of State, earlier this year, as you said, the government published the UK global tariff, which would apply to EU imports if no deal is reached. But the Prime Minister last week changed that, didn't he, when he was speaking with the Liaison Committee. And he actually committed to reciprocal tariffs if there is no EU deal. Now, reciprocal tariffs mean that under WTO rules, the UK wouldn't be permitted to give any other country with whom we also have no free trade agreement any better or worse trading terms than we were giving to the EU. So the EU would actually be dictating our trading terms to the rest of the world. How is that taking back control?
Well, I think what the Prime Minister was signalling when he made that point, and I think it might have been in response to a question from Mr. Parish, was that obviously if there wasn't an agreement, the EU would apply their common external tariff to UK products entering the EU, and the UK would apply its UK global tariff to products entering the UK. I'm not sure it's right to read in.
Generous interpretation, Secretary of State, because he actually made it as a specific promise in contradistinction to the UK global tariff. He said, no, they will be reciprocal. So if it's a particular tariff that the EU in the common external tariff puts on lamb, then we'd apply a reciprocal tariff. Now, that's a big change in the position. And as I say, it certainly doesn't take back control. It actually cedes control to the EU of the tariffs that we would apply reciprocally to them, but also to the whole of the rest of the world with whom we had no free trade agreement.
Well, I think, if I might say, you may be reading a bit too much into the use of the word reciprocal, because I think the way I would put it is the EU would apply their common external tariff, their tariff schedule, and the UK would reciprocate by applying its UK global tariff, its tariff schedule. And that's not to say that the two would be identical.
He implied it was a change in position. Was he just confused about that?
I think the point is it is a change in position from the temporary tariff schedule from last year, when you'll recall the proposal was to have quite a large number of tariff suspensions. So I think the point he was probably making is, unlike the run-up to no deal where there was a proposal for a temporary tariff schedule, we would actually be applying the UK global tariff.
I think you'd make a very fine spin doctor, Secretary of State.
Thank you, Barry. Geraint, please, now. Geraint Davies.
Yeah, Secretary of State, you'll know that the Japanese trade deal agreed state aid rules which were stricter than those required by the EU. So given that in other words, wouldn't you accept that we could accept those state aid rules in order to avoid a no deal? And in the event that we do have a no deal, if that's on top of ending furlough and a resurgence of COVID, would you accept that there'll be millions more of people thrust into hunger? There's already 6.6 million people in food insecurity. And what do you anticipate doing if in January we've got more than 10 million people who are in hunger?
Well, on your first point, the approach that the government's taking on all of the trade deals, and that includes not just Japan, but also the EU and US and Canada, is that, of course, it's a common feature of all trade agreements, including the one that the EU has with Canada, that you can have some what's sometimes called level playing field provisions, which is where sides give an undertaking to abide by similar objectives on things, but it's not the same as being bound by another country's law. So the difference between what a normal independent country asks for in a trade agreement and what the EU have been to date asking for is the EU want what's termed as sort of ex ante control of state aid, which is that we would need to seek their permission before we could grant any aid to any business in advance, and subject ourselves to the procedures of the EU court. Now, that's something that no other ordinary country seeks to do. So that's the difference. And I think the issue might be a misunderstanding between a common and conventional inclusion of a level playing field type provision that's quite common in trade agreements, and effectively an attempt to bind us to EU law, which is the difference. Look, on your second point,
which are much more lenient, though, aren't they? You know, Germany, the state aid for Germany and France, etc., is much more lenient than Japan are allowing us. I accept your point, but wouldn't you accept mine that we'd end up with more lenient restrictions and avoid a no deal?
Well, look, overall, on the UK-Japan agreement, it's important to recognise what we've got in the agricultural sphere. We've secured, and this is mainly a continuity agreement, a rollover of the things that matter most to us, particularly on sectors like beef and pork, where the market access and the trajectory to liberalisation remains on course. And there are then one or two areas where we achieved more and got more than the European Union managed to get with Japan, particularly on some areas around rules of origin. So products containing pork have got better access than the EU was able to secure. And then there are one or two, smaller areas where, we weren't able to get quite as much as the EU did. Some of the TRQs around, protein drinks and smaller areas that we didn't quite get the same rollover. So you have to look at these things in the round, and overall it was a good agreement that meant we achieved all of the key things that the EU-Japan agreement had, plus a few more besides.
Hunger?
Well, as I think Mr. Parish raised that point earlier, so we are working very hard to get a withdrawal agreement or a future trade agreement in place so that there can be zero tariffs on goods. If tariffs are applied, the impact on consumer prices is fairly modest. But insofar as there would be impacts on consumer prices, obviously the government will monitor that closely. And as we did last year during the coronavirus outbreak, we would take action where it were needed.
Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Geraint. Right, now then, Ian Burns, you're going to come in on question number 1, which is question number 2 now. So over to you, Ian. All right.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, how did the COVID response affect DEFRA's preparations for the end of the transition period? And how will the advent of a potential second wave impact on these preparations further?
If I'm honest, it's obviously delayed things for and set back certain programmes in the first couple of months that it affected us worst. There were, and I might ask Tamara at this point to come in because she might have the figures, but we redeployed some staff from a number of other areas. Some of them were working on EU exit to help deal with the initial response to the coronavirus outbreak. It probably delayed some of our SI programme and some of the legislative programme. It meant a delay some of our important bills, in particular the Environment Bill, but also the Agriculture and Fisheries Bill slipped a little bit because of the disruption to the parliamentary timetable. But the only thing I'd say is we have been round this course now several times in terms of preparing for exit. So we're, those of us that are veterans of the sort of several attempts at no deal have become quite proficient in the issues, and there's a sort of sense of deja vu as we come around these again. And a lot of the preparation that we did for no deal last September and October is fit and ready to go now as we plan for the end of the transition period. And the final thing is that businesses have been there's been a marked increase in their interest and engagement on the need to prepare for the end of the transition period since around June. And so the larger retailers and supermarkets and the bigger players who are responsible for the bulk of the trade between the UK and the EU have been actively engaging with us now for some months and building their preparations. We've still got work to do, in particular to raise business readiness and make sure that everybody is ready for the new requirements. But we're doing a major exercise at the moment to ensure that happens.
Oh, just to add on to that, you're comfortable where we are at this present time then?
Yes, I mean, comfortable would probably be the wrong term to use because it might suggest complacency. And, Michael Gove chairs a regular cabinet subcommittee that crunches through every last minuscule of detail on our preparedness for the end of the transition period. So comfortable would be the wrong term to use, but am I confident that we are doing everything that's necessary to make sure we can have a smooth end to the transition period? Yes.
Thank you, Secretary of State. Can I just ask the Permanent Secretary then a follow-up question and give you a quick breather? Have a glass of water. So, Permanent Secretary, how many DEFRA staff are still working on the COVID-19 response and what work is still paused?
We took immediate action at the time to reorganise people, set up an emergency centre, set of cells. We had probably at the peak around 1,000 people working on COVID, but a lot of that was shift working and so on to be able to kind of manage the work. We then, by the end of June, we had stood down some of that work and retained a kind of core, particularly around a core sort of emergency centre and work particularly around kind of economic impact on our sectors. It's hard to exactly put a number on what we've got, but we probably have around 50 or so. But that there are a number of people who are working on or doing more than one thing in some of our kind of areas and some of our particular policy areas. So that probably underplays the number of people tracking some of the work on COVID. We are keeping it very much under review and actually have a much greater ability to move in an agile way to move our resources around. We did pause some things, as the Secretary of State said, we are able to look at where we would need to pause things if we need to move more people into that work going forward.
So you're confident in the potential advance of a second wave that you've got the ability for DEFRA to operate fully staffed?
I mean, and yes, my confidence, I know what it is that we will clearly prioritise the work that we need to do on COVID. We will prioritise the preparations for the end of the transition period, which is very much ramping up. So I'm very keen not to have gaps in there, and we've got a plan to assure that. And some of our major delivery programmes, such as future farming, if we need to have the conversation with the Secretary of State around prioritising other areas, we can do that, and I'm confident about our ability to do that.
Thank you, Permanent Secretary. And back to the Secretary of State for the last question. As we head towards the end of the transition period, the issue that keeps me awake at night is millions of our fellow citizens, as being outlined by two of my colleagues, struggling to put a healthy meal on the table for them and their families. Minister, what keeps you awake at night?
Gosh, I sleep quite well, I have to say, given the pressure on my time at the moment, and as you certainly need your sleep in this particular role. But I suppose the greatest issue really with the end of the transition period is the uncertainty at the moment about how the EU will respond to certain things. And It's fair to say that during the negotiation they've been somewhat aloof on a number of important areas, such as whether they will give us a third country listing for products of animal origin, which should be a no-brainer, should be straightforward. They granted it at the 11th hour in the run-up to October. They should do. There's no justification for them not to. But until things like that are secured, that becomes, obviously a significant issue. And there are a range of other things as well where we don't quite know how ready they are. So we can do all the work in the world to make sure that our borders are ready and that we know exactly how we're going to handle lorries and goods arriving here, and that we've done all the work in the world to ensure that our own traders have got the export health certificates they need and the CAT certificates they need. But if when they arrive at the other side, it's all a bit slipshod and disorganised, and there's therefore chaos because of failure of the EU to plan, well, that's something that is beyond our control. So that I think would be the greatest concern.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Secretary of State.
Just before we leave this question, I've got Brexit issues, logs and progress monitor here in front of me. There are 10 parts to it: labelling, third country approval, certification approval, so all sorts of things on here. 8 are red, no progress, and only 2 are yellow. So, I'm not saying it's all your fault. Some of it may well be the EU's fault, but surely there's an awful lot more to do, isn't there, Secretary of State, to actually get these agreements in place?
Yes, well, the key ones on our sectors that are unresolved, but unresolved only because we've gone through an application process, but the EU's yet to decide to move them forward. Securing a third country listing for products of animal origin, securing an equivalence agreements on things like organics, which is bound up in the FTA, similar requirement for equivalence on things like seed potatoes, a whole host of things around labelling and marketing standards where we need them to, again, recognise certain regimes and inspectorates that we have and the efficacy of our regime. All of these should be straightforward and simple, since we start from the point of view of having processes and systems that are identical to the EU, let alone equivalent. So they should all be very straightforward and easy to do. But obviously, until the European Union confirm that they will do that, and put it through the correct process.
So is it politics or is it procedure? What is actually stopping it? Because as you quite rightly say, as we leave the EU, we have exactly the same systems in place, exactly the same rules. Most trade deals take ages to sort out because there's not the equivalence of trade rules, and yet we've got exactly the same. And yet they're playing very, very hardball. So the only thing I can say is it is politics and not process that's the problem.
Yes, I think the way I would characterise it as a negotiating tactic dressed up as procedure. And that is something that obviously...
So I think your answer to my question is yes, it's politics, isn't it? You wrapped it up slightly, but I think... Could I go as far as to press you on that?
Well, I'm not sure I'd use the term politics in that it's a negotiating tactic that the EU is saying, well... difficult for us to progress this until we know what's happening with the free trade agreement, which isn't technically correct, but they're using that sometimes in some cases.
But bluntly, I had 10 years in the EU, and so therefore, in representing this country, and so therefore, the EU believe that the single market, the whole system they've got is so marvellous that they can't believe anybody in the world will want to leave it. So surely they're just trying to make an example of us and being extraordinarily difficult. So how do we break that logjam?
Well, I think all you can do, and this is exactly what David Frost and the negotiating team have done, is be absolutely clear about the type of agreement we want, be absolutely fair about the way you deal with the EU and engage in their concerns, and that's what we are doing. But also to be clear about where your red lines are and things that you cannot do. And I think that is been a consistent approach that the Prime Minister has taken, and he's given authority to David Frost and his negotiating team to stick to that mandate. And so there hasn't been the sort of backtracking and swapping and changing of position that perhaps characterised our negotiating approach at points in the past. And I think that's welcome.
Okay, thank you, Secretary of State. Right, question number 3. Neil Hudson, please, Neil.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. And thank you both for being before us today. If I could come to you, Secretary of State, and I'll preface my sort of comments again by putting on the record that I declare a professional interest as well as being a parliamentarian. I'm a veterinary surgeon, so this question has elements of sort of veterinary staffing issues in it as well. But Secretary of State, you said that part of the anxiety moving forward as we come to the end of the transitional period is the uncertainty about our classification as a country, whether we'll get third country status, etc. And we've taken evidence from various different stakeholders within the food sector, from meat processing through to veterinary surgeons, who've expressed concern that as we move towards the end of transition with this lack of clarity, that potentially do we have the infrastructure and the people ready and able to step up with the additional levels of checks that need to be done. And you've mentioned export health certificates, and there are the introduction of certification support officers. But how do you respond to those sectors' concerns moving forward? Are we ready for this increased workload, and do we have the people and the resources to do this?
Yes, I mean, it's an area that we're working on, and we've done quite a lot of analysis to ascertain the scale of the issue. And broadly speaking, we estimate that there are around 1,000 to 1,200 businesses that need an export health certificate because they're in products of animal origin, and then potentially another 600 to 800 businesses that are involved in the export of fisheries products. So it's probably in total something in the region of about 2,000 businesses that are engaged in this trade and therefore need to familiarise themselves with what's needed. There's then a question about how many export health certificates might be needed, and our estimates there, it's very difficult because trader patterns might change and the numbers of consignments might change, and you could get consolidation of consignments. It's hard to judge. But our analysis at the moment suggests that it could be in the region of 100,000 to 300,000 export health certificates needed per year. And then to process those and issue those, we estimate that you need roughly 200 or so full-time equivalent vets to do those for the products of animal origin. And due to a quirk of the way the regulations work, it's usually environmental health officers in local authorities who issue the EHCs for fish. And we probably therefore need around another 200 of those. And to put that in context, there's around 1,000 environmental health officers at the moment, and we've been working with local authorities to support them to increase their capacity so that they've got the people to do this. And there's also a piece of work going on to support recruitment of and training of additional vets who can support work that already goes on. And it's important to recognise that this is done by private veterinary practices. Many of them would already provide export health certificates. For instance, if a meat processor was sending pork to China or the Far East, they would already be doing this work. So some of them are quite familiar with it. It's just about increasing that capacity to cope with the additional workload.
So that's interesting. You talk about increasing the capacity. So yes, hopefully the certification support officers will be able to help the veterinary surgeons, but equally so you do need veterinary oversight for a lot of these checks. And when we took evidence from the British Veterinary Association the other day, we talked about, and I wanted to ask that the government is working on this, looking at veterinary staffing levels moving forward, both in the short term as we end up with potentially increased checks as we enter the end of the transitional period, but equally so moving forward in those sectors with movement of vets across the EU and that side of things. So it's reassuring, Secretary of State, that the government, and can you confirm that the government is looking at that, keeping a watching brief on veterinary staffing levels in terms of training, recruitment and retention of this profession in the months and years ahead? Yes,
so we are doing that. We are looking first of all at recruitment, and you're right. Obviously the person that signs off the EHC would have to be somebody who the EU were comfortable could sign it off, and so that would require vets in a lot of cases. Sometimes there is administrative groundwork that can be done by other supporting professionals, so with the vet making the final decision to sign things off. And we are doing some work to increase capacity and to support the expansion of vets in this area. But in addition to that, as a belt and braces approach, we're also designing contingency plans with our agencies like APHA, so that if push came to shove and there was a gap in capacity, we could come in with the state veterinary service to help complement what those private vets are doing. I don't know whether Tamara's got anything to add on that.
Yeah, I mean, we're expecting training, more training starting in October to both for official veterinarians and for certifying support officers. So there's £300,000 going into that training. But I mean, some confidence can be had from that we were at sort of 600 qualified vets in February 2019, and we're now double that at 1,200. So we think we need some more, but we have made that increase and got the certifying support officers agreed as as a support mechanism and increasing that. So in this area, I think we're making good progress, and the plans we've got to the end of the year will take us to a place, together with the contingency that the Secretary of State set out. I think we do feel confident in this area.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. If I can come now, Chair, to the second part of my question, slightly different tack, but talking about the preparations for the movement of animals and animal products across borders. And in 2019, the government evolved the Operation Brock in terms of managing heavy vehicle traffic in the southeast as it moved over to the EU and vice versa, and trying to have contingency planning for potential delays and prioritising things such as perishable seafood. But other sectors such as meat and dairy have expressed concerns that their sectors were not prioritised in that. So do you have any comments about that, about the preparations if we did have any delays in the border regions, as to what those sectors and what support can be given to them and compensation for exporters for some of these other perishable products potentially?
Yes, so the position that we took last time, and broadly speaking, we're planning to do the same again, is obviously in the hierarchy of objectives. First is to keep the flow moving at the border. So a lot of work going into making sure that before a lorry leaves, it's actually got the correct paperwork and that it's gone through a particular process and knows that it's got the confidence to be able to clear checks at the other side. After that, if there are problems, and as I said, if there were issues with a lack of EU preparedness, which then led to pinch points and difficulties with ferries sailing and crossings and so on, well, at that point, Operation Brock would kick in. And we've always said that at that situation, if lorries were being held for some time, we would prioritise fresh fisheries products because they're highly perishable, and also day-old chicks, where there's a small number of lorries, typically 3 or 4 a day, but it's an area where we are the EU market leader by some way, and also there would be animal welfare considerations if a lorry load of chicks obviously got stranded. So we chose to pick those two. The difficulty with broadening it out is, first of all, there then becomes a question of where you draw the line. And so I think, we know that the number of lorries carrying fresh fish is a relatively small number overall. It's probably typically between 70 and 80 per night, and a tiny number, as I said, of those carrying day-old chicks. Once you start broadening it out to other sectors, like lamb or dairy, you're suddenly into a different order of operation. And at that point, to be fair, it just gets very logistically difficult for Kent Police to manage such a prioritisation exercise. But also, there starts to be questions of fairness, in that if you're going to do it for dairy, why not certain other sectors who might also have critical timelines, albeit that it's not a perishable product. So we've chosen just those two that would be worst affected, and I think that's the right pitch.
Okay, thank you very much, Secretary of State, for clarifying that. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Neil. Then, Secretary of State, question 4. When will the government publish its response to the 2019 consultation on live exports of animals? And do you still believe that the UK could ban live exports of animals after leaving the EU?
Yes, we've got as you know, a manifesto commitment to do this. We've had a consultation for obvious reasons with coronavirus and the redeployment of resources. Some of that work and the response to that consultation, has been delayed. But we've got a number of legislative commitments in our manifesto, including, in addition to taking action on live animal exports, issues such as recognising animal sentience. And so it is our intention, when parliamentary time allows, to legislate in these areas.
You don't see any conflict between sort of getting animals across from the Scilly Isles to Cornwall or from any of the islands in Scotland to the mainland for processing, slaughtering, because the 22 miles of water between us and France, if their animals are travelling in good conditions, is it such a problem?
Well, these are, as you can imagine, once you look at these issues and the detail of them, lots of complexities present themselves. And so transport regulations, for instance, are generally devolved, and we would have to ensure that animals could be transported from the Shetland Islands and Orkney back to the mainland. There are certain issues like that which we need to iron out, and that's why we had the consultation to take on board everybody's views to ensure that we can get this policy absolutely perfectly right.
So when you say it's devolved, is there a chance then that in the future that Scotland and Wales would allow live exports and England would ban them? Where would that stand?
Well, I think when it comes to trade issues and those international issues, that is more of a reserved area. But some of the areas that we've consulted on, for instance, and that we're inviting views on, relate to changes in transport regulations, travel conditions, and that's the other part of it. And some of those issues are indeed devolved, albeit that we will, as far as possible, try to work within a UK framework.
Okay, so but you're not actually looking at the type of transport and the way that export is going to be done. You're just looking at banning it. Is that right? Well,
as I said, there's a consultation. We're looking at all the responses, and we're considering a range of options, considering the legal position as well on some of these matters, and looking at the right way to deliver, our manifesto commitment, which is to bring an end to the export of live animals for slaughter.
Okay, Dave, you'd like one, and then I'm going to bring Neil Hudson in.
Yes, just very quick, Chair. Thank you, Secretary of State. I think you're absolutely right in terms of the animal welfare element and the transport element of it are, of course, devolved, but the market is for much of this transportation from the islands and the Highlands in Scotland is to England, which crucially for the time being is not export. So it would be helpful to hear explicitly that the moves in terms of an export ban will have no impact to producers moving live animals across the United Kingdom as currently constructed.
Yes, so I can't. So one of the things that we're consulted on is things like maximum journey times, and there are other issues, for instance, affecting sectors like poultry, around poultry transport and ventilation, to ensure that you don't get mortality during transport, which is a problem in some areas. There are some important areas around transport regulations that we think are ready to be reviewed. But look, absolutely, Orkney and Shetland and Scotland are all part of the UK. That does not constitute an export.
Okay, thank you for that clarification, Secretary of State. Neil Hudson, please. Now, Neil.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, I think the tack I'm going to come down now again is movement of animals across borders, and our committee is going to be looking at that in more depth in the coming months. And I guess you've said a couple of times, Secretary of State, a lot of the anxiety is the uncertainty as to what our status as a country is going to be. But can you give the committee some reassurance that preparations are underway and that guidelines will be clear and available quickly when we know more, so that stakeholders moving animals around across borders can actually respond quickly and efficiently? And I guess the areas that I'm referring to, depending on our third country status, would be, say, for instance, the movement of horses across borders as well. And so, as you know, we're part of the tripartite agreement, UK, Ireland and France, and knowing whether that seamless movement of those horses will still be in play. And equally so, the movement of pets with the Pets Travel Scheme. There's still uncertainty until we know where we're at. But is DEFRA ready and nimble when we know more as to where we're at, so that clarity can be made to those stakeholders? Because I think a lot of people in the various different sectors, whether it's equine, whether it's people with pets, are worried and uncertain. So can you give us some assurance?
Yes, I can absolutely give you the assurance that our officials have been working very closely with Commission officials, making sure they have all of the information they need to consider the approach in these areas. I mean, the reality is, as is common with virtually every issue on this front, there is no justification whatsoever for the EU not to put the UK on the list that would enable something akin to the pet travel scheme we have now to continue. In that there is no rabies in this country. Indeed, the pet travel scheme was predominantly put in place to stop rabies coming from other EU countries to countries like the UK and Ireland. So there is no justification for us not to be on that list, but there is a process that we have to go through, and we are going through that process. And for now, we have to assume the worst, plan for the plan for the best, but assume the worst, and that is ensure the people recognise that if the EU does not put us on that list, then we would just be treated like any other third country, and they would have to vaccinate their dog before they travelled to the EU and go through all of those particular processes. So we have to, but as soon as we're able to give people that clarity, we will. And you're right, equines is another key area.
So yes, I guess if we go right up to the 11th hour and both sides blink and we get that status, then we can respond. But equally so, you're making the preparations as if we didn't have that movement. But certainly in the equine sector, they would need to know whether the tripartite agreement is going to continue. And there's a lot of movement of horses amongst those three countries as well. So, but I guess you are ready and responding quickly when we know more.
Yes, and I think the tripartite agreement itself may be a bit more problematic, just because that was as its name suggests, a three-way agreement by France, UK and Ireland that predated the European Union. And I think us leaving now, the EU generally don't like side agreements between nation states. They like to do it all themselves. And so I suspect that the tripartite agreement itself might be more problematic, but at the very least we would want to make sure that the other provisions, recognition, for instance, to enable equines to travel, can be put in place.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Secretary of State, just very quickly, 5 puppies at the moment can be brought in under a pet passport scheme from Europe. I don't see why you go and buy 5 puppies for your own use. Are you considering tightening up on the number of puppies that could come in a future scheme?
This is something we've always kept under review, you're right. If any puppy, though, that is coming in commercially, or any dog being brought in commercially for sale, is supposed to come in under a different regime, which is the Bali Directive. I know there's been concerns expressed for some time that some people are bringing dogs in under the pet travel scheme for sale, which would be illegal. That's not what the purpose of that scheme is. All I would say is in this area, in terms of that illegal use of the pet travel scheme to bring puppies in, we have for a number of years now run quite a major operation between APHA and port health authorities to ensure that we are checking that puppies that are coming in are of the right age. And I think it's quite a large number, something like 600 or 700 puppies that were underage have been seized and rehomed because of this illegal trade over the last
But you
few
know
years.
yourself, how many people actually need 5 puppies? How many individuals go out and actually buy 5 puppies for their own use, and to keep? Very, very few. And so I think it's a loophole. I think we could probably discuss it all afternoon, but I think it's one of those issues that you ought to keep on the in your sights, really.
Yes, I guess arguably there could be expats who spend half the year in Spain, who love their dogs and take in every dog that comes their way, and have half a dozen spaniels around them, and they might travel therefore with 5 dogs that are genuine pets. So we can't rule out there'll be genuine cases like that.
Yeah, I'm sure we could have a license for that, really. So,
Chair, can I just quickly chime in
quickly,
just a final quick question on that?
Yeah, go on, very quickly, Neil.
Just very quickly, I think it's really reassuring. I guess as we are coming out of the transition, we will be able to tighten up on animal welfare issues such as the sort of puppy movement as well. But Secretary of State, will we could you confirm we will also be able to tighten that on animal health improvements as well? So doing things like reinstituting the mandatory tick treatment for dogs moving in, so that we then won't get exotic diseases coming into the UK and potentially with zoonotic risks as well. So we can actually improve the health and welfare status of our animals in this country and potentially indirectly people.
Yes, I can confirm we'd be able to do that. And you put your point on the finger on a particular issue. We used to require mandatory treatment of ticks coming from certain dogs coming back from certain countries to avoid an invasive species of tick getting into the UK that I think was particularly associated, from memory, with Lyme's disease. And
Eustice as well.
Exactly. It was the EU veterinary authorities that overruled that and required us to remove that restriction. So we will have that chance to revisit some of those sorts of issues.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll park that one there. We'll come back to it, I'm sure, Secretary of State. Right then, question number 5. Robbie, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, my question is going on to food labelling. So this has been highlighted by the food industry as one of the most complex issues as we're preparing the country to come out of the EU trading bloc. So my question is the government planning to provide an adjustment period, which has been suggested by the Food and Drink Federation, for potentially 12 months for food businesses as part of coming out of the EU?
Yes. So in terms of goods coming in, we've already confirmed that on labelling on a whole range of things, from foods right through to fertilisers, we will recognise a sort of dual system of labelling, at least for a standstill period. We reserve, obviously, our right to change those requirements at some point, but initially, at least in most cases, for 6 months, we don't want to make this any more complicated for people importing goods than it might otherwise be. The bit, of course, that we can't control is goods going the other way. And so, in that regard, if the EU have particular labelling requirements, and this might affect sectors like organics, we would need to be advising businesses that they might need from day one to be labelling in a way that the European Union would find acceptable and compliant with their rules. But all of the SIs that we put in place to bring across retained EU law last year, in many cases, those made provision for recognition of dual recognition of labelling requirements from the beginning. So,
just on so at the moment, just to clarify, you're looking at a potential adjustment period of 6 months, based on the industry saying 12 or 21 months. Do you feel that 6 months is actually achievable, or you don't see any complications coming?
Well, we'd need to look at I'd need to look at the specific areas that they are mentioning, but certainly everything that we've done to ensure a smooth end of the transition period and the legislation we put in place has, generally speaking, while we've reserved our position in a number of key areas, not least because the EU have also done so. We've reserved our position in a number of key areas, but on simple things where businesses will have stocks of labels that were compliant and needed to be used by EU law, we're not planning to make dramatic changes to those anytime soon.
Focusing on organic products, are you confident the EU and the UK will agree equivalency for organic products and food labelling?
Well, there's no reason why not to, in the sense that the EU currently recognises groups like the Soil Association as being accreditors that do a competent job. The regulations that we have are the same as those that the EU has, so it'd be very difficult to see why they wouldn't recognise equivalence, given that our starting point is that we have identical rules and a system of accreditation that they already accept. Mm-hmm. So it ought to be possible. My understanding is that the EU are engaging, on this matter in good faith and are, seeking to guide through that particular process.
Okay, thank you.
Dave.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of labelling, Secretary of State, if you're going to buy a strawberry, you should really buy one with a salt tire on it, because that will mean that it's almost certainly come from Tayside or Fife, and hopefully Angus, for the very best tasting strawberries that money can buy. However, a very real risk, this is a wee bit tangential, Chair, a very real risk to that production is the availability of labour, and we on this committee have talked a great deal this year about getting domestic labour working in the harvesting of edible horticulture, and with some success but not nearly enough success. And colleagues in the National Farmers Union of Scotland and their counterparts elsewhere in the UK are very clear about the gap between what we've got in the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Scheme and what the actual operational demand is, and they're looking very much for clarity, because obviously, as I'm sure you know, the horizon of that deployment of labour in terms of purchasing plants and putting them in is very, very soon for next year. So what reassurance and confidence can you give to horticultural growers, soft fruit and vegetables in the UK, that they will be able to access the seasonal foreign labour they require?
Yes, well, I mean, as some committee members may know, I must take issue with Scottish strawberry. Much as I support the Scottish strawberry industry, I was a strawberry grower myself in Cornwall, and we grow very, very good strawberries there as well. And having spent 10 years in this industry, I am very familiar with the issue. I think if I talk to some of the major players in this area, both in soft fruit, but also people like G's in salads, generally speaking, what they found this year is that roughly a third of their labour was the UK workforce, and the websites like the Pick for Britain were quite successful at getting people to come forward. Roughly a third were under the SAWS pilot, mainly from Ukraine, and then the remaining third to a half were EU citizens who were already here. And that mix worked reasonably well. Most would tell you, I think, that the level of productivity among UK workers who are less experienced at doing this sort of work was lower on average. That churn rates, loss of staff and staff turnover would have been higher on British workers, but nevertheless they made a significant contribution this year. And what we need to consider next year is what the right mix is between those with settled EU status, possible continuation of a source scheme of sorts, and also, though crucially, in a year when we could see some significant increases in unemployment, and with sectors like hospitality potentially being affected, making sure that the industry is doing all it can to provide work for those people who might be losing their jobs, sadly, over the next few months.
So I would advise, though, that horticulture members in the National Farmers Union of Scotland, 40% of them have responded to a survey to say that if they can't get access to foreign seasonal workers, they won't be able to continue. And I think some of the very compelling evidence that we've heard is that the difficulty with a lot of this type of work for domestic workforce is that there's only a certain amount of domestic labour available within travelling distance to where the actual demand for labour is. So it will be subject to the law of diminishing resource, and that will leave a demonstrable gap between domestic capacity and the demand of the sector. And I think people need reassurance that the government, the UK government, will activate a system which allows foreign workers in the right amounts to come in and work in that sector. I'm not hearing that.
Yes, well, I mean, look, this is it's an area that obviously we are, discussing, with the Home Office at the moment. But all I would say is I do think it's important in a year where we are, also likely to see, sadly, some significant increases in, in unemployment, that we make sure that the industry is doing absolutely everything it can to make space for people who might be losing their jobs. So it's getting the balance right on all of these things. But it is an area that we are, in discussion with the Home Office about.
Thank you.
Just before we leave this question to go to question number 6, the organics. We've been now talking, I remember going to DEFRA probably nearly 2 years ago, and we were talking about how difficult it was to get the EU to recognise our organic status. And yet I would suggest that our organic status is largely higher than a lot of the EU countries. I mean, why is it taking so long for them to recognise us? Again, is it the politics of the EU rather than the practice of, because surely our organic production is right. Why is it not recognised?
Well, I think it is, partly because, at times it's being bound up with the discussions on the future free trade agreement. And, the EU have been quite open about saying, well, this is bound up in that agreement and we have to wait and see what happens with that. And then there are other areas where it's less legitimate for them to make that claim, where, for instance, on third country listing, where they take the view that they signpost you to the process but are not in a hurry to progress it. I think it's probably the best way to put it.
Okay.
But, there is every possibility.
Organic producers are very, very worried about this.
I think they probably are, and it's there's with all of these things though, there's every possibility that if there's an outbreak of calm and consensus and an agreement put together, these are the sorts of issues that can actually be resolved very quickly, and people can go through whatever processes need to happen very quickly, since there's no substantive concern, if I can put it that way. So if the will is there, these things can be resolved very quickly, but obviously we can't guarantee it will be there.
You can imagine if you're an organic producer, then you are quite worried, aren't you? Because the politics is one thing, but your business is another. And can you, export? That's the trouble. So, I'm not saying you aren't doing the most you can about it, but it is an issue that needs to be sorted, like all of this, really.
It is. That is the case, although, I think in response to that, I would say that obviously, if there weren't an agreement and tariffs were applied in both ways, the UK is a major import market for EU produce, and so there would be displacement of EU organic produce through the tariffs approach, and that would make space for homegrown produce on our shelves.
Okay, thank you, Secretary of State. Right then, Dave, now you start off with question number 6 and then followed by Geraint, please. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, how would you address the reality that, in actual fact, the mutual recognition component of the UK internal market bill simply means that, to take food standards, for example, it will be English food standards that now apply right across the UK in contravention of devolution?
I'm not sure I'd accept that caricature. It means that each devolved administration will be free to set its own approaches in certain areas, but it won't be able to prevent products being marketed through our internal market. And that's not actually that different to... so it's not about English standards. Equally, if Scotland decided to adopt a different set of standards to England on a particular area...
A lower standard.
If it were, depends how you... But if it were a different standard, or I'm sure you wouldn't caricature it as a lower standard if you chose a different standard, but if they chose to, let's take it at the face value of what you say, a lower standard... well, that would still be able to be marketed in the rest of the UK. The important thing to recognise is on all the important areas here, things like pesticide authorisations, food safety, food standards Scotland and the FSA work from a common evidence base. They often share a lot of evidence, and their scientists and assessors reach judgments based on the same evidence. And the same is true on pesticides, that the Chemical Regulations Directorate and the Expert Committee on Pesticide make recommendations to all of the administrations. And they tend to make, therefore, broadly similar judgments based on that common evidence base.
I think that's true, and I think that's worked very well over the previous period of devolution, 13 years of devolution. And while all entities of the EU were obviously of the UK were obviously all members of the EU, but that's changed now. And that presents very much greater flux in the system, if you like, because this is a discussion in terms of the mutual recognition. This is a discussion about the floor, not the ceiling. There's no ambition to drag everybody up. There's an ambition to make sure that as low as one element of the UK sets the standard, that will apply everywhere else.
Yes, and that is really what happens in the EU now. So it's already the case that Hungary, for instance, could choose to authorise a pesticide that we don't allow in this country. Crops treated with that could be sold in Scotland, and there's nothing that the Scottish Government could do about that. And it's also the case that GM crops could be grown. Scotland could prevent them being grown in Scotland, but it could not stop GM crops grown in, say, Spain or Italy being sold in Scotland. So that's not a new problem, and I think it's probably less of a problem in that in the UK you would have at least all of the national administrations anchored around a common evidence base, whereas often what you have in the EU is the principle of mutual recognition, but national authorities will do their own thing based on sometimes different evidence bases.
So you don't see any conflict then, because if it's sticking with the EU dynamic, if the EU was seeking to introduce this, any member state could apply its veto to the agreement and seek to negotiate something that was more favourable for their market, whereas in the UK government hasn't even had a meaningful discussion with devolved administrations about this. They've just been told this is what's happening, with or without legislative consent. Do you think that's something that you would accept if you were in government in one of the devolved administrations?
Well, as I say, we already accept this as an EU member, but I think people exaggerate the extent to which we have a veto. The vetoes only apply now, really, I think, in tax matters. So in all of the areas that reflect DEFRA, qualified majority voting applies. And it's regularly the case that the UK will take a position, but be in a minority, not have a qualified majority or a blocking majority, and so things will be done that are against our interests, and we accept that.
But
so
even,
it's not
even if Scotland, in the context of, or Wales or Northern Ireland, in the context of the UK, did have qualified majority voting, which we don't, the asymmetry of the UK is such that it will always be on England's terms.
Well, that is why we have, under our constitution, a devolved settlement rather than a federal model. In a federal model, you can have things like qualified majority voting, but they tend to work best if you've got a relatively large number of states that are of broadly similar size. So the EU manages to do that, although it's got quite a range in size of states. Once you get to the UK, as you say, where you have England, which is much larger than the other component parts, that federal model doesn't really work. And that is why we've always had a devolution model, which is a large amount of power is devolved, but there are certain important things that remain reserved.
Yeah, but in 21 years of devolution, this is the first time that a power has been de facto removed from a devolved administration, because I'm sure what you're going to say is that no powers have been removed. But in actual fact, if England can set a food standard that lowers the floor of food standards in Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland, that is in reality, maybe not in principle, but in reality that is control over a previously devolved matter.
Well, I'm not sure I agree, as I said, for the reasons I gave earlier, that it's already the case that the countries like Hungary and Denmark and others will take different approaches on some of these matters. But it would be unlawful for Scotland to ban those products. So we have at the moment a single market within the EU. We'll have a similar principle really of an internal market that means there can't be blocks against trade taking place, but that doesn't prevent individual countries from adopting their own approaches.
Okay. But the lack of consultation and the lack of discussion, and some would argue respect, and I would be one of those, between the UK government and the devolved administrations in this matter. Do you have a view on how this has been received by civil society in the devolved nations?
There was a consultation document. I was involved in putting that together earlier this summer, and obviously I think as we speak there are debates, or about to be debates, going through Parliament on these matters in the usual way, and I'm sure, Mr Doogan, that members of your benches will be very vocal in that debate, and that's what Parliament's for. So I think it's fair to say that given the amount that we need to do in preparation for a smooth end to the transition period, yes, this legislation is happening at quite a pace, but it's not true to say there's been no consultation. There's been a consultation document, and there'll be a great deal of debate.
Can you identify a single compromise that's been made as a result of that discussion and consultation? That a devolved administration said, we can accept this but no more, can you change it?
This is a Bayes bill, and so Alok Sharma, Secretary of State there, has been leading those particular discussions. But look, in DEFRA we have very good relations with the devolved administrations on the agricultural components, and the crucial thing about the UK Internal Market Bill is it also provides for, and still relies very, very heavily on frameworks being agreed, so that we all act within certain parameters and within agreed UK frameworks where improved coordination is necessary.
I think I would echo those good. Last one, it's a comment actually, Chair. I would echo the Secretary of State's comments that good working relationships have been developed over 21 years, but I think we'll find they'll be under significant strain going forward as a result of this bill.
Okay, well, I hope we can make those relations work. Geraint, please, now. There's Geraint.
Wouldn't you accept, Secretary of State, that this recent legislation is basically stopping Wales, in particular, and indeed Scotland, setting higher environmental and food standards? And by way of example, would you accept that if Wales now wants to ban 9 single-use plastics, which it does, and in Westminster they want to ban only 3, then what will happen is in Wales we won't be able to ban 9, we can only ban 3. So that's driving a coach and horses through devolution, because previously we could.
I'm not sure I understand a specific point that you're making, but generally on all of these fronts, for every part of the UK, there will be an enormous number of new freedoms that come our way. Freedoms to run agriculture policy in a completely different way. Freedom to design the administration around those policies in a way that is less bureaucratic and works for our own circumstances. And yes, freedom to set your own environmental frameworks and targets and standards in a way that no part of the UK has had really for decades. For the last 40 years, we've all been operating within a highly restrictive, centralised legal order set in the European Union. And it's curtailed all of our freedoms to act in a way that's right for us. So all the UK Internal Market Bill does is ensure that those different policies can't be used as an excuse to frustrate trade within our islands. And I think that is right. That's got to be the sensible thing to do. It's a principle of mutual recognition. But beyond that, there is very, very widespread power, newfound power for every part of the UK to do things differently.
But if you were, for instance, allowed hormone-impregnated beef through a trade agreement that Wales wasn't involved in, because the WTO and Donald Trump told you to, then Wales wouldn't even be allowed to label that hormone-impregnated beef to protect our consumers and from premature puberty of young children from eating it. Because of this bill, we couldn't even label it, let alone stop it being sold. That's true, isn't it?
On that, there would be some areas where labelling would be allowed, so devolves could do their own approach to labelling. Some areas where it might not work, but these are things that we are that we are looking carefully at, and there would be frameworks to address.
Thank you.
Shall we Secretary of State, hormone beef is illegal at the moment, isn't it? So you're
course.
looking to legalise it?
No, it is, but
country?
I was, rather than going down that route, I was treating it as a hypothetical question.
Oh, were you? Okay, I think you better make that clear for the record, Secretary of State.
There is a prohibition on sale in every part.
Yes, along with a chlorinated chicken. Right, thank you very much. Right, now then, question number 7. Sorry, what's this? Yes, to Tamara, please. When will the committee see the common framework DEFRA is leading on, which is a provisional framework to be in place from January? When are we likely to see that?
Yeah. I mean, we're working on a set of kind of 15 common frameworks, and we're working very closely with the devolved administrations on that. And we are doing some official level assurance in October, early November, and looking for sort of parliamentary scrutiny in 2021. I think there have been conversations about what the right timing and so on is, but they're as I say, close working to develop that to have. So
you haven't actually got a date at the moment, is that right, or what?
No, my understanding was that there were conversations, including with this committee around the timings. But the minute where we are is at the point of being able to sort of these official level scrutiny. October, early November. There'll be some technical engagement with stakeholders over the next month.
Right. Please, could you write to us, keep us informed
Absolutely.
Of the timing. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Right. We're going to move on to fishing now. So we're going to start with Sheryll and then Rosie and then Barry. Right. Sheryll.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Secretary of State, do we have the staff, boats, systems in place to control, licence and enforce access to fisheries from the 1st of January?
Yes, and this is an area that we've been working on. So we've introduced a new fish export system. And as I said earlier, we estimate there are probably around 800 businesses that export fisheries products. Getting on for, I think, 270 of those now are already registered on that system. So the systems to issue catch certificates is already in place. I mentioned earlier the work we're doing on environmental health officers in local authorities to build the capacity for export health certificates. And in fact, in Scotland, the DFDS developed a very interesting concept of a hub where all lorries destined for export markets could go through a hub to get the necessary paperwork they needed. So we've got a reasonable level of confidence in that part of the system. We have recently procured additional access to planes for aerial surveillance so that we can monitor things, particularly in the event if the EU don't share with us their vessel monitoring data. And we have also procured, I think, an additional 3 offshore patrol vessels from the commercial sector to supplement the vessels that we already have access to from the Royal Navy. And we've also got the Joint Maritime Coordination Centre, which involves a number of vessels, cutter vessels that work with Border Force. Many of their staff have been retrained so that they can do fisheries protection work as well. I think we've trained around an additional 70 fisheries protection officers, warranted officers, to undertake that work. And we're also doing some work considering, what tactical responses these additional assets might make, in the event that we had, severe breaches of the law. So I think on all of these fronts we've done a lot of work. Obviously it's a big change, and but I think I'm comfortable that we've done a lot of preparation work.
And could I just sort of expand on that? You mentioned the new vessels that you've presumably commissioned from the commercial sector. Will they be staffed by MMO staff, or will they be staffed by Royal Navy personnel? Or crewed by Royal Navy personnel?
So it changes around. So the Scottish Government, Marine Scotland, commission their own fisheries protection vessels, and they are in the private sector. So they are private contractors, but where there are officers that are authorised to do fisheries protection work. The commercial vessels that we are contracting will also have, I think they will have MMO officers on there, warranted officers. but I might need to double check that and get back to the committee. And of course, the Royal Navy vessels, the Fisheries Protection Squadron, is the oldest part of the Royal Navy, and they will continue to be there to assist in this work as well.
Are you confident that the Scottish Parliament have seriously taken their responsibilities, seriously on this? Because of course Scottish waters make up quite a significant amount of UK waters. And are you confident that they have put enough emphasis on ensuring that UK waters are protected once we leave the European Union?
We've been working very closely with the Scottish Government and other devolved administrations on this. So I think, yes, I think I would say, look, although we all know that the Scottish Government would prefer not to be leaving the EU and not to be leaving the CFP by definition, it's also the case, I think, that they recognise that the Scottish fishing industry is a large, important industry, and that they have to be ready to police this and do whatever enforcement activity is necessary. So I think there's an understanding about the importance of this to the Scottish fishing industry.
And finally, the inshore fisheries and conservation authorities, some of those have their own vessels, and they obviously police and enforce the regulations in the 0 to, I think it's 12-mile limit. Are you confident that they will be able to step up to the mark should we see any breaches that may occur with historic rights being denied to other EU nations after the 1st of January?
Yes, so one of the things that the new Joint Maritime Control Centre is doing is bringing all those different assets together. And some of the IFCAs have their own vessels. Some of those, as you will know, in Cornwall, are vessels that actually can go some way out to sea. And we are looking to make sure we coordinate all of those different assets so that we can respond to what's necessary. So at the moment, IFCAs tend to be restricted to the 0 to 6 mile zone. But we will, where necessary, be using them further out where they've got vessels that can go further out.
And finally, before I finish, have you had any discussions with the Secretary of State for Defence that should you need other platforms to make sure that we can carry out our enforcement as an independent coastal state under UNCLOS, that those platforms would be available for you to call on should that be necessary?
Yes, so we are working closely, obviously, with the Ministry of Defence. And so far, a decision was taken to delay the decommissioning of the previous old offshore patrol vessels so that they could be kept as reserve capacity. The new ones have been commissioned. Some of those, I think at least one of those is on duty elsewhere, but we've got a commitment to be able to draw on 2 of those new ones in addition to the reserve capacity, and then on top of that we've got private contractors as well to supplement that. I think the Secretary of State for Defence is very clear that they stand ready to help and assist in any way we might need as the end of the transition period approaches.
Thank you very much. I'm sure fishermen will be very reassured to hear that, Secretary of State. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheryl. Rosie, please now. Rosie, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, are you able to guarantee that those things will be in place by the 1st of January? I've been hearing about Operation Brook and Operation Lorry Park and all sorts of things for months and months now, and I really need to reassure the smaller fishing communities like mine in Whitstable, that things will carry on moving. What's the potential damage to those communities if things aren't in place by the 1st of January?
Well, look, I think we've seen really through the coronavirus pandemic early on in those early months when all of the key fish markets such as Boulogne closed down, that obviously had a very serious impact on fishing communities to the point that we did a hardship payment to them. So we know that the impacts would be quite severe if they could not get their product to market. But in answer to your question, this is an area that the government's put a lot of emphasis on. As I said, it starts with making sure lorries have got the correct paperwork before they travel. And then it's all about ensuring that we maintain those flows at the border. And if a problem does arise and we have to instigate Operation Brock, because that's a fallback position, something that we do only if things start to go wrong, then at that point there would be an ability to start to do prioritisation.
Okay, so is there a way of potentially compensating people that export oysters from Whitstable, for example, because we export most of them to French restaurants directly, so it's such a time-sensitive product, it can't be hanging around in lorry parks?
Yes, and that's why our priority, if you like, rather than paying people lots of compensation for not getting the goods to market, is to help them get to goods to market by making sure flows maintained at the border. And if things start to go wrong, to then ensure that perishable goods still get to market by prioritising the flow of those particular vehicles. And I think that is a better way to approach this challenge rather than get back into compensation schemes.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rosie, very much. Barry now, please. Barry Gardiner. Barry, please.
Thank you. Parliament Secretary, if I can direct you to the positive list of eligible countries that the EU operates for all fisheries products. The Secretary of State said earlier that because we've the same processes at present, it should all be very simple to get on that list. But you'll be aware that in the past, even though we were a member of the EU, they raised serious concerns about our ability to monitor and enforce our fisheries to the appropriate standards. So last week, civil servants at DEFRA were unable to confirm whether the UK had in fact applied for third country status. So can you confirm, have we, and have the EU agreed that our monitoring and management meets the benchmark, and have they granted us that third country status?
So we have made applications for third country status across a range of areas and are assuring that we are providing the information that is required for that to happen. We have not yet been granted third country status, as the Secretary of State was talking about earlier, and are still part of the process and assuring that we have provided the technical information that is required for that process.
So specifically then, Permanent Secretary, when did you apply for third country status for fisheries? And when would you normally expect, if it is as easy as the Secretary of State suggested it might be, to receive an approval that we do meet the benchmark? Because my understanding is that we have to show that we meet the benchmark. You can't just say, well, you've always accepted it so far. And presumably that's why you've gone to such lengths to acquire the additional vessels.
Shall I just come in? So on fisheries, it's a very high... It's a very high bar. So the EU has a system for ensuring it doesn't buy fish from IUU countries, and that's, as you will know, Gardiner, that's when you've got that's when you've actually got countries that have no control systems, no quotas, where their vessels fish illegally, and they're designated an IUU country, and in those instances, products are not allowed in. You know, that's just...
Yes, you remember, Secretary of State, that there was a letter that came from the EU, it's some years ago now, but that complained that we didn't have the systems in place. And you'll know that not all of our boats have VMS or electronic logbooks. The Catch Act, which you piloted, is not yet at an enforcement stage. So when we come to issue a catch certificate, and the competent authorities should have cross-checked against the landing declaration, we can't do that, can we? So how can you guarantee that the UK catch certificates meet the requirements for third country listing?
Well, as I said, because a lot of the initial systems that we're going to bring across from the EU are EU systems, and there's a world of difference between saying a country is an IUU country that's fishing illegally and outside controls, and saying that
it's a red herring, and no pun intended.
This
is do we match the appropriate monitoring systems that would enable us to get on that positive list of eligible countries? And without VMS, without electronic logbooks, without being able to cross-reference, the landing declarations against to get the catch certificates, we're not going to be able to do that, are we?
I come back to what I said. These are, we already have more cameras on vessels, remote electronic monitoring than any other EU country, and our control regime is probably more robust than some of the others. The report you're citing is related to it's very, very small issue really around catch reporting for the inshore vessels that we have subsequently put in place anyway. We have the catch app. We've been doing catch reporting. And that is what that specific report related to.
We wouldn't have been putting in place all these new vessels. We obviously have to do a lot more than we were doing in order to comply. But please, can you tell me, when did we apply for third country status for our fishery?
Well, I will. If you want a precise date, we will have to write to the committee and give you that date, which we can do.
Well, thank you. Yes, that would be extremely helpful. One final question, and that is, can you tell me what's the word I'm looking for here? What was the at-sea surveillance hours last year? Because we know that in 2018 it was 2,000 hours, and I believe you said to the Lords on the 4th of March that you had increased the capacity 5-fold. So can you confirm that there were at least 10,000 hours in the 2019 year? That would be helpful. I mean, it still doesn't compare with the 16,000 at-sea surveillance hours that there were in 2009. But these seem to me to be all the areas where, if the EU are playing hardball with us, they are going to want to push on. And they're going to say, well, look, your at-sea surveillance hours are a fraction of what they used to be.
The point I was making on a 5-fold increase in capacity, that's around capacity that you can draw on, not necessarily what's deployed. It's not the same as what's deployed. Yeah, so when I've talked of capacity, that's about capacity as in increase in vessels and the impact of increased aerial surveillance. It's the capacity you can draw on rather than what's actually deployed. So the answer to your question would be the 5-fold increase wouldn't necessarily mean that 10,000 hours had been deployed. It's just they could have been drawn on. I think there was an increase, but again,
to the committee and tell us how many at-sea surveillance hours there were last year and how that compares with previous years.
I'm afraid I can't recall that figure, so rather than try to remember it, we will write to the committee with the accurate figure.
Thank you.
In writing, Barry, okay? All right?
Ready?
Thank you. Right, okay, thank you very much. Then it is question number 8 now. Geraint, please, question number 8.
Secretary of State, the Environment Bill as currently drafted doesn't provide the Office for Environmental Protection with an enforceable system for enforcing environmental standards. And the chair of the Office for Environmental Protection won't even be in place in January. So how do you intend to change the Environment Bill, or have you another strategy to enforce standards which reduce air pollution as causing tens of thousands of deaths each year, and on top of that, pollution-aggravated COVID deaths? What are you going to do, or will you allow air pollution just to go up?
Well, we've started the process of recruiting the chair of the OEP, and what we will do, although, as you point out, the delay to the bill means that the legislation won't enable it to be formally established by the beginning of the year, what we will be doing is establishing it in embryonic form with a secretariat to support that first chair who is appointed. And, in those first few months, obviously, there'll be quite a lot of work to do in terms of designing and working out what their strategy should be, which is a requirement under the bill. So they'll have quite a lot to get on with in the first few months in terms of establishing themselves and setting themselves up. They will then become, formally established, obviously, once the bill receives royal assent. And after that, the next really big project for the OEP will be its engagement and its involvement in the setting of the first set of targets, which will come in October 2022. So although there's been a slight delay, it will be in place in good time to deliver its most important task. And that secretariat in that initial form will also be able to help the chair process any complaints that might come in.
But as you've just admitted, the standards won't be in place until 2022. And you'll also know that the research from Harvard, for example, shows that a 1 microgram difference in PM 2.5 per cubic metre can induce an extra 8% of COVID deaths. In the Netherlands suggests it's 15%. So given that this is a life and death issue, don't you think we should be fast tracking towards World Health Organization standards, actually written into the bill, 10 micrograms per cubic metre PM 2.5 by 2030, for example, in order that we can reduce the death rate? And secondly, how can you defend giving the responsibility for air quality to local authorities when in many instances they're not in charge of building major roads which run through their local authorities, which are the cause of lots of the pollution? Are you going to look at changes to the Environment Bill so that we do have enforceable standards like we had in the EU, or are you going to let more people die unnecessarily?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that through retained EU law, the legal requirements and the legal framework that led to action in all of these areas, including on air quality, that's come across and that remains in place. What we'll be talking about in the Environment Bill through the new target structure, and we've already started some engagement with key interested parties on what that should look like, and we will be consulting on those targets in the new year. That's setting out a new set of domestic targets that will drive our policy on a range of environmental areas, air quality, but also water quality, biodiversity and waste and resource management too. So it's not the case that there is nothing there and that there's a void, as you, I think, were sort of indicating, because retained EU law has brought across the existing apparatus.
But can I have this clear? What you're saying is there'll be targets as opposed to standards and air pollution limits that are enforceable in a court of law. At the moment, Climate Earth, for example, have taken the UK government to court for breaching these air quality limits. After the end of the transition period, there'll simply be targets, and if those targets aren't met, they can simply be changed by the Secretary of State. So we'll no longer have enforceable air quality limits that are enforceable in the courts. That's correct, isn't it?
Well, no, there would be legal obligations to abide by law. And as I said, many of these things come across in retained EU law. And the OEP will have a role in terms of holding government to account on those. It will have the ability to take legal proceedings if it's not content with a mediation process it goes through with government. So there will be an OEP that will have those enforcement powers, but will also play a very important part in shaping those targets, reviewing them, reviewing and commenting on the annual update on progress towards the 25-year plan. And so I think that the architecture we put in place is actually really quite powerful. There's a strong role for the OEP as a regulator and to hold government to account. But there's a renewed role for Parliament as well in terms of putting in place and having the freedom to put in place the policies that will achieve the targets we set.
But so if the Prime Minister continues to encourage people to get back in their car and go to work, which has led to congestion levels now to London 50% higher than before the lockdown, and if the Chancellor continues to freeze fuel duty for diesel and pollution continues to go up and death rates continue to go up and COVID death rates are also exaggerated, will the government be taken to court for exceeding these EU limits still? And if so, who will they pay the money to? Themselves?
Well, there wouldn't be fines because there's no point having a system where one body fines another in the same country. But yes, it would be the case that if there were serious failures with compliance with environmental policy by a government agency or the government itself, then yes, ultimately the OEP would be able to bring that through the courts.
What, and fine the government?
Not fine the government, but bring action, a judicial review or a similar type of review with, through the courts. And that's set out, those powers are very clearly set out in the Environment Bill.
And to do what? Increase the price of diesel and encourage people to use public transport? I mean, it's just going to be a completely failed system, isn't it, that you're introducing?
Geraint, can we make that the last question, please, Secretary of State?
That is the last question, Chair. Thank you very much.
I don't accept the terms in which you present this option. I think that during our time in the European Union, we've ended up being quite blinkered and quite wedded to a very restrictive set of rules that actually hasn't really delivered for our environment. It's led to lots of litigation, lots of money for lawyers, hasn't actually really delivered properly for our environment. And we've got a great opportunity now as we leave the EU to not just think about how we stop things getting worse and prevent deterioration, but how we can really build back nature. And that is what absolutely is at the heart of both the Environment Bill, but also the Agriculture Bill and Fisheries Bills too.
Okay, thank you. Just on when will we be likely to see the new chair in place so that we can actually have some sort of scrutiny of that chair? And do you see some independence for that particular chair, he or she?
Well, obviously it will be an independent role, and that's set out in the bill itself. I might ask Tamara whether she can cast out on the timings of the appointment to the chair.
Yeah, so obviously we're in the process of that appointment and the kind of shortlisting and so on, and then there's an opportunity for this committee to hear from the proposed person.
I've heard by the rumours are that it might be the end of December. Is that right?
I think December is a likely time for that appointment.
Okay. Right, thank you very much. Right, thank you, Geraint. Question number 9 on LEADER. Will the same levels of funding go to rural businesses under LEADER and the Rural Growth Programme be maintained after the end of 2020? Because I think it's going to be paid by the Shared Prosperity Fund, which won't be DEFRA anymore, will it? So do you have any control over that? Do you know what's happening?
Well, look, we're engaged, obviously, since we've got an interest in it as the department that was running these parts of the fund while it was under the EU, but it will be a component of the Shared Prosperity Fund in future. We're in dialogue with Robert Jenrick and the MHCLG on these matters, but it's too early to be able to
and so it'll be completely seamless, will it, when it goes from being paid under the present system to being paid under the Shared Prosperity Fund?
I'm sure it will be seamless, but I'm afraid if you wanted to talk more about the specifics of the Shared Prosperity Fund, it may be that Robert Jenrick, Secretary of State and MHCLG, is somebody you might want to.
There've been a lot of villages and have made very good use of it. There's a lot of businesses. There is some very good things that have been done under LEADER, so it would have quite a dramatic effect if it suddenly doesn't come about. So anything you can do to have, I partly make a joke about seamless, but shall I say government doesn't always do things seamlessly. It's probably not just the colour of the government, it may be the process of government. So could you do everything to make sure it does, please?
We will be. It's never for lack of trying.
Right. Geraint, I think you wanted a supplementary on this one, didn't you? Then that is positively your last question, I think. There are, Geraint.
No, thank you so much, Chair. I just want to ask something about the Shared Prosperity Fund. If I may, in Wales, the Shared Prosperity Fund, the predecessor of the Shared Prosperity Fund, which is EU funding, has been repurposed to combat the COVID pandemic. And I want to ask the Secretary of State whether the successor to the shared, the successor, which is the Shared Prosperity Fund, whether that will still be able to be used during the pandemic period for those purposes to help people.
Well, the successor funds in most of these areas, I think, for complex reasons of EU budgeting, I think for the next couple of years, there's still, for most of the devolved administrations, quite a lot of residual EU funding that we've paid into that will still be coming back. That will come back under the existing EU scheme rules, and so in respect of further coronavirus issues, if Wales had residual budget left, then it would still be able to repurpose that budget. In terms of future Shared Prosperity Fund that's likely to take over from around 2023 or possibly 24, then that is when you would, that would be very much something we'd need to consider in the design of those schemes.
But can I ask, this may not be your expertise and I respect that, but the problem has been that the Barnet consequential for COVID in Wales has been done on a per person basis equivalent to England, and because of the demography of Wales, because it's older and poorer and sicker basically, we need more money to provide the same provision that would be happening in England, and the extra money is provided by the EU. So next year, are you saying extra money will still be available from the EU? Or because I think you're saying that the Shared Prosperity Fund, which is the successor, won't happen for a couple of years, in which case there may be a gap in funding, which would be a big problem in the midst of a pandemic, a no deal, and at the end of furlough.
That is your last question, Geraint.
Okay. And I might, unless Tamara wants to come in, we might write to the committee, because it is a complex area around the budgets, in the sense that Pillar 1 of Common Agricultural Policy, as of next year, we're already funding directly. Some of the Pillar 2 schemes carry on for some years under the EU system, so that the countryside stewardship, but the Treasury starts to underwrite that funding. And then on other ones like RDPE and some of the ERDF funds, for reasons of the way EU accounting works, some of the money is still technically coming from the EU even after we've left. So it's a complex picture, but I might write to the committee to set that out.
Yeah, I think
it will continue to December 2022, the applications up to June 2021. So I think it will be for that period.
Right, I think what we'll do, Geraint, is we'll get if we have some more evidence in writing, please, on this one, so that we can. Yeah, thank you very much for that. Right, Derek Thomas, welcome to you've come in now because of the number we can have around the table. So welcome. You want a supplementary?
Thanks, Secretary. I'll be very brief on the shared prosperity, and it may be that Robert Geraint needs to answer it. But are you able to say yet when real guidance will be available to local communities about how shared prosperity won't just help the farming and fishing, etc., but also communities as a whole who might have previously had European funding?
I'm afraid I'm not able to do that here today, but all I can say is we obviously as a department are engaged with MHCLG on this, because we've got an interest particularly on those rural programmes. But it is, I'm afraid, very much it's an area that they are leading on. They will no doubt be in discussion with other departments like both BEIS and no doubt the Treasury as well on these matters. I know that it's something that Robert Geraint's working hard on, but as I said, I think a little bit earlier, it may be that you need to get him before your committee.
He may, but in the meantime, can you give us as much written evidence on this as you can, because it would be very useful, because a lot of people are worried about it, as Derek has said. Right, also welcome to Julian Sturdy, because again you've just come in because of social distancing. So question number 10, Julian, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Secretary of State, for being here. It's been reported that DEFRA is considering a stepping stone scheme for the next year to support farmers through the transition to elms. Are you planning additional support over that period?
We've been giving quite a lot of thought to the transition, the agricultural transition, to ensure that it is what it says, a transition with year-on-year progress to the end state we want to get to. rather than a big bang revolution with a new IT system and a brand new system that farmers have to get used to. So we will be saying more on this a little bit later this autumn, publishing a further document that sets out a bit of a route map through that. But I think I can go as far as saying that one of the things we are looking at is whether we can, in the years 2022 and 2023, roll out elements of the future policy that are, if you like, a prototype version of what will then become consolidated into the eventual environmental land management scheme. So we're giving some thought as to how we could use approaches that we've either done in the past through things like ELS type schemes or indeed things that we do now through countryside stewardship, increased participation in some of those as a stepping stone to the new scheme.
Okay, but you haven't got a date in the autumn yet?
We don't have a date yet, no.
Right,
but
okay.
But we are. It is a document that we are working on and anticipate publishing probably in the next month or two.
Right. I think that would be very good for the committee to know that as soon as possible, because obviously time is ticking, isn't it?
Secretary, this is not Elms 1, is it? This is something else, is it? This is another hybrid that you've come up with.
The document will effectively describe the transition process from the types of reductions we intend to make in 2021, what we then intend to do in 22 and 23, when we might de-link, what type of productivity offer we might make, what other schemes we've got in mind. We've already set out in a document we published earlier this year the broad concept of 3 tiers. One, there would be a tier 1, which is around sustainable farming practices, catchment sensitive farming and so forth. A tier 2, which is rather akin to the existing countryside stewardship, and then a third tier, which might be more of your sort of ecosystem services and land use change. So that's been set out, and we'll be developing more detail in this next document.
The concern I would immediately have over that is that it sounds like it's not going to give farmers much time if it's coming in the autumn for 2021. So can you give any reassurances that those first changes are going to be something that can be adopted quite quickly?
Yes, well, the first changes we've largely already announced, in that we've already announced that we will switch off the so-called greening, so the crop diversity rule, the EFA rules, none of which ever achieved anything much at all for the environment. And that we will start those reductions to the BPS that we've outlined previously. And we will be saying a bit more about what we'll be doing with that funding, but we've previously suggested, for instance, that there will be an increase in productivity grants. That's something we're looking closely at, alongside 1 or 2 other areas as well.
Still quite a short time period for those, any productivity grants or anything like that to be for farmers to bid for, etc., isn't it?
Yes, but we will in that first year we will be using we will be opening schemes that people will be familiar with that we've used in the recent past.
Right, okay, thanks. One final question, if I can. Is it correct, so the pilot schemes on this, so you were talking about 6,000 pilot schemes on this, I think, weren't you, on the Elms, but it's dropped to about 1,000, is that correct?
I'm not sure I recognise that number. We had around 50, I think, tests and trials, and there is now going to be a pilot that will be initially, I think, open to a few thousand farmers. If that's what you mean. But I could.
Yeah, well, I thought it's that pilot, but I thought originally it was talked about that it would be open to about 6,000, and now it's only going to be open to 1,000. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, just in terms of the kind of ramping up of the pilot, we'll be starting smaller in that earlier period. I think made that decision before the kind of February document, and David Kennedy and I came and spoke about. So that's the ramping up of the pilot.
Is that because there hasn't been the interest, or is that because it's just that DEFRA can't only want to take 1,000 at the moment regarding capacity?
It's about a measured approach to building to building the pilot, rather than a lack of interest.
So was there the interest?
Well, we haven't opened the pilot.
Right,
pilot yet. It was about taking a measured approach to what the Elm pilot.
So it's more.
There is a lot of interest though from the tests and trials that have been done, and some quite people that have been engaged in that process have been quite excited by the potential. And in particular, farmers working together on a landscape scale, I think, has been more successful than you might have thought. Often farmers like to just do their own thing, but actually that kind of landscape scale approach has been supported and has been quite, it's thrown up some quite interesting ideas.
Yeah, because my view was that there was a lot of interest out there, and I'm worried that you're actually closing it down by shrinking the number of pilots that are going to be available for people to take part in.
It's less about availability, but it was about what we were kind of projecting in those early stages and how we could ensure that we could learn from them.
Okay, thank you.
Vivian. Robbie.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And my question is just following on from Julian's actually to do with the pilot schemes, and I was just wondering if there's a recognition at DEFRA on the scale of the transition from currently what a farmer is able to receive through subsidy money to what they're likely to receive further down the line. So take the Tier 1 example that you were illustrating for a lowland farmer. Currently, when that farmer is receiving BPS and maybe Countryside Stewardship Scheme or previously ELS or HLS, they may have netted around £200 to £210 per hectare. And my understanding is under a Tier 1, which would be open to the vast majority of farmers to be able to access, the funding would be down at maybe up to tops of £50 a hectare. And I was just wondering if you feel that has been recognised, amongst the wider agricultural industry, of the scale of transition that we're likely to be seeing.
Yes, and it's why we're doing this gradually over 7 years. And in those early years, as budget is removed, we will roll out schemes that farmers can get back into. It's one of the reasons we didn't want just a restrictive pilot that only a small number could get into and everybody else would see a diminishing BPS payment. But we do want to maintain that trajectory to remove what is an arbitrary area-based payment that doesn't make a lot of sense and replace it with something that everybody can access. That makes a lot more sense and pays them generously for delivering the things we want them to do. Mm-hmm. And so we will do this, gradually. We'll probably, as I said, de-link at some point towards the latter part of the transition, and that's the point at which we'll accelerate to the new scheme. But the sum of money that's there is going to be the same. It's just we'll be applying it in different ways.
Mm-hmm. And just finally, Chair, if I may ask, just about the actual global pot of funds. Is this reflective going forward of what the existing cap is, or is there flexibility to actually make the global pot actually reflect what environmental achievements we want, the aspirations that we have, as well as the transformation that we're wanting to see for the agricultural industry? Or is it just simply ring-fenced to previous global funds that were available?
Well, our manifesto commitment is that it will be the same in cash terms for this Parliament. Obviously it's always welcome if the Chancellor decided he wanted to go above that, but I suspect that the envelope is pretty much as we set out in the manifesto commitment. Beyond that, though, I think it's very important to recognise that in the longer term, we are looking at green finance models, other ways that you can lever additional money in to deliver some of those environmental outcomes, whether that's through water companies or green bonds. There's quite a lot of interesting ideas there that could bring additional green finance to the table to supplement what's there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
And just finally on this one, Secretary of State, I think of the original schemes, about 60 of them, I think only about 7 were farmer-led. When you think 70% of the land is actually farmed, why was this so low? I think you've actually tried to sort of adjust this, but I mean, can we be assured that these schemes, we expect environmentalists to be involved, but we do actually expect the farmers to be involved because they do actually have to carry out this new regime when it's done. So are you confident that you're properly piloting schemes with the farmers?
Well, I think we are, and I'm not sure, and Tamara might better recognise that figure you've given, that only 7 were farmer-led. I think...
There weren't very many, were there?
Well, it depends. It depends what you mean by farmer-led. I mean, all of these schemes... I mean, my basic view about this is the agriculture policy that we envisage is fundamentally about a system of rewards and incentives for managing land in a particular way. And in the final analysis, you can't do any of that without the landowner being absolutely front and centre, or the occupier of the land, in the case of a tenant, being front of centre of what you're doing. So while there may have been coordinators and other bodies that brought things together, fundamentally those pilots can only work if the farmers and landowners and tenants are engaged in the development of it.
And just finally, when David, was it David? What was the name? I know him so well, really. But David Kennedy was here. He actually said that the document that you were saying is sort of available in November, December, would be available at the end of the month, saying about laying out this scheme. So how confident can we be that by November, December, we actually will have this document?
I think fairly confident, but look, I've learnt in this job not to under-promise and over-deliver rather than the other way around. We've all had experiences. You will have seen ministers answer questions that something's imminently, going to be published, and then the next question is it'll be in due course. Sometimes processes and clearance processes take a bit longer.
Yeah, your predecessor, summer and autumn, seem to get sort of rather muddled and join up.
But
as soon as you have that available, please, we would be very keen to have that. Final question 11, and thank you for being so generous with your time, is Derek Thomas. Now, Derek, you wanted a supplementary on the Labour situation because you weren't here when we were discussing it. So
very, very briefly.
And then do question 11, okay?
So, Secretary of State, you obviously share a bit of the countryside that I do, and we're going to have a difficult time in the spring when our fields are covered in daffodils, but they may not be picked. So is there any way that the SAWS scheme or some other scheme can enable people that would normally be here to pick Orientals can be from January the 1st? What is the thinking where we are on that at the moment?
Yes, so as I said earlier, we're in discussion with the Home Office about what the appropriate mix for our seasonal labour will be next year. We have to accept the context that there's a rising unemployment rate, and some sectors may be quite badly affected by coronavirus, so there could be a larger number of people than normal looking for work, and some of those might even come from sectors where they might be East Europeans who were working in agriculture 10 years ago perhaps. So we need to be conscious of that in terms of setting what we do. Recognising that many EU citizens return year after year, and some of those will have gone for settled status. But then there probably will be a need for some sort of scheme, but we're discussing what that might look like. And in the context of ornamentals, it was always the case that we chose in the early years of the pilot to focus it on one area, and that was edible horticulture. But we've always been clear that if we were to roll something out more broadly, well, then we would at that point bring sectors like flowers and ornamentals into it as well.
I only raise it because obviously it's coming very close, and we're already seeing daffodils poking their heads up. Yeah. So can I take on to question 11? Is that okay? So obviously today is the news about the further restrictions in order to address and combat coronavirus. We saw at the very beginning of this pandemic quality cuts of meat not being needed because there just wasn't the demand in the hospitality sector. And obviously we're not closing down hotels, pubs, restaurants again, but we are restricting how much they can deliver. Obviously, if they're already restricted in terms of how many can physically sit, the weather will drive people indoors, so that will restrict the number of covers that can be provided. And then we're saying they must be fed and out by 10 o'clock. So are you concerned about the impact that will have on the sector, but also on the suppliers? Are they going to be in a similar situation as we were early in the year? And I know it's early days, but what do you believe the government can do or may do to really help support these people until we can get back to something of a normal economy within the food and farming?
Yeah. I mean, the restrictions that the Prime Minister's announced today are, I think it's fair to say, generally speaking, a sort of toughening up of things that were already there. And the reason we've done this is, for reasons everyone understands, the infection rate is growing quite quickly, and we need to sort of act early to dampen the virus and contain the virus so that we don't have a more serious problem where we might have to take more dramatic action later. So it's about acting in a way that admittedly people will find puts additional pressure on certain parts of the economy, but it's about acting early for the very good reason that we want to keep restaurants open, we want them to keep trading. And so we've put in place this 10 p.m. curfew to try to dampen some of the problems there might be with infection towards the end of the night in some of those venues. But we very much want them to stay open, and we're trying to support them in keeping open. So in answer to your question, I don't think there will be any noticeable impact on sectors such as the beef sector that did have that dislocation of premium cuts and steaks early on. I don't see that being a problem that would arise for what we've announced today. But also we should recognise that even when we did the full lockdown, the market did adjust quite quickly, and supermarkets saw a big increase in those sales as well.
Thank you. I mean, I guess we're just concerned that these businesses that it is actually viable for them to stay open, given the time of day they can open and the having to go indoors. But thank you, Chairman.
Let's hope they eat before 10. That would be very useful if they do. Julian, were you catching my eye? I think yes.
Yeah, just to follow up on Derek's point, really, because I thought this is a really important point to the sector, and we saw last time that, as Derek pointed out, that people's behaviours change, shopping behaviours change, and beef was a classic example of that, and it did have a big impact on the industry. So do you believe the economic consequences to the hospitality industry have been properly taken into consideration when taking these decisions, and what arguments were laid out at Cabinet? You might not be able to answer all that, but I just thought I would put that in. What arguments were laid out at Cabinet for the hospitality sector?
Well, I think all I can say is, because as you will understand, I can't give you a chapter and verse account of what's discussed at Cabinet or even
just ask it
Cabinet subcommittees. But look, we absolutely recognise as a government that some of these measures will cause a little bit of additional pressure on some of these sectors, but we've done this to act in a timely way early to prevent the real risk that we might have had to sort of close them down further down the line altogether and go back into a hard lockdown. And I think most people recognise and understand that. We think the curfew, setting it at 10 o'clock, means that they will, if they structure things right, be able to do their 2 sittings, but ensure that people then leave the premises by 10 o'clock. We recognise it's an extra restriction on that sector, but we think it's necessary to dampen the spread of the virus. That's the only reason we've done it, and we think we've done it in a way that is cognizant of some of the issues and challenges that they'll face.
Okay, well, thank you, Secretary of State. Thank you, Permanent Secretary. It's nearly 2.25 hours, so you've been very generous with your time. Can I thank members as well, because it's the first time that we've had a hybrid system, and it's been good to see you both here in person, and thank you for members, and thank you for the members that went in and out of the room as we were doing it. It almost went seamlessly, I think, so I thank members very much for that, and thank you both very much for very straightforward, frank answers. There'll be some written evidence that I think we've asked you for. We could like that, please, as soon as possible. And we very much appreciate the time that you've taken today and being with us. And I think we've got a lot of good stuff on record. And I'm sure we'll be having you back again for further updates, especially on the trade deal or the not trade deal with the EU in the very near future. So thank you very much.
Great.